Good morning, everybody.
Hello.
Thank you. A travel solution track. This is part one of the travel request solution, and we're going to talk a little bit about, sort of all the different sessions that are going to be in this track. But real quick, just to get it out there, before everybody gets too comfortable, this is a very beginner InfoPath session, so it's mostly pretty much beginner stuff about InfoPath, so I just kind of want to let everybody know that ahead of time. Just we have a little bit of advanced stuff, but most of it is for learning InfoPath and just basic stuff. So just kind of wanted to let you know that. I'm Laura Rogers. This is Jennifer Mason. And this is building the travel request solution part one. And so we're going to talk a little bit about ourselves real quick, and then we're going to talk about the whole solution and what it entails, and then we'll get started. So I'm Laura. I am a Microsoft MVP. I live in Birmingham, Alabama. And I work at Rackspace. Our company, SharePoint 911, got purchased by Rackspace recently. So you'll notice that my blog is SharePoint 911/blog/Laura. So we're still kind of co-branding there with both of the companies. And here's my Twitter name up here.
So my name is Jennifer Mason. I live in San Antonio, Texas. Just newly moved there. Moved from Ohio to Texas. And I also work for Rackspace. So part of SharePoint 911, we work there. So you can find me on Twitter, find my blog, and find different pieces of information there.
Kind of a little bit about both of us. Like, our background is we enjoy building these business solutions, doing what we can with out-of-the-box SharePoint. So no code, a lot of InfoPath. We do a lot of workflows and web part connections and data view web parts and things like that. But everything we do is no code, and we like making the most of what we can do with SharePoint. And we know when to resort to code, so we know when to you have to bring those developers in. But we like to push it as far as we can until we get to that point. So that's kind of where we're coming from and what we do on a day-to-day basis. Here are some books we've written, so you can talk about yours first.
So we have a couple of new books out, Creating and Implementing Real-World Projects with SharePoint. It follows a lot of the format that we're going to follow in this type of session where, Laura's holding it up. So O'Reilly has given me a couple of copies to give away in the sessions today. But it's start to finish, so starting with your requirements, looking at your use cases, and then building out an entire solution and doing the governance. And so there's 10 different, almost like recipes that you can follow to build different types of solutions. And so that one has just been out about a month. And
this is using Microsoft InfoPath 2010 with Microsoft SharePoint 2010 step by step. And Dervish Shadravan and I wrote this one. And he and I are going to be collaborating together on the very last session today, but this is our InfoPath book. And then Jennifer and I have also written together, we kind of have the pictures in reverse order, but the beginning SharePoint 2010 Building Business Solutions with SharePoint, Jennifer and I and a couple of other people wrote that one. And again, it's all that same theme I talked about. It's those out-of-the-box business solutions.
So how many of you guys you use out-of-the-box solutions to build SharePoint? Is that kind of where everybody falls into? Do you guys use mostly InfoPath and SharePoint Designer? How many of you guys would rate yourself experts in InfoPath? Okay, I love it.
Well, good.
I'm glad beginners? Is everybody
is
kind of beginner in InfoPath? No?
Good.
Little mix? Okay.
Perfect. Okay. All right, so our agenda is that we're going to do our introduction and overview. We're going to talk about the whole track, and then we're going to go through just designing the form and building out a travel request solution. We're going to talk a little bit about what that solution entails. So this is, we had some slides about the whole entire track together, but we'll just go ahead and introduce Matt so he can get off the stage.
Hi.
We're going to, so the first session we have is this one, and this is a travel request solution that's got a form, an InfoPath form that users would fill out to request travel. And then in this session is just building that whole form, just going through the process of how you'd build a form and publish it to SharePoint. And then the second track is going to be automating it, so building a workflow for that travel request and going through an approval process and everything that travel request would need to do. And then the third session is, I'll let you explain that one, or Jennifer.
User interface, do you want to?
Yeah, so we're going to look at different ways that we can use the out-of-the-box web parts and even using SharePoint Designer to build an interface that is more inviting to the end user. So how can we put the form on the home page? What can we do to the form to make it less like I'm going to a SharePoint site, I have to create a list item, and more like an interactive application like they're used to using, just using the simple out-of-the-box solutions. And so in the third session, we're going to just look at the basics of web parts and web part connections and putting all of those elements together.
So I'll be helping with session 2 and 3, and that's a good time for me to leave. So hello everybody.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
So the whole way that this process is going to go for the automation part, just quickly, this is just an overview of what Matt and I are going to be doing, but it's, a travel request gets submitted and it goes through basically 3 levels of approval and it's completed. So that's just a quick overview of how that's going to work. So this is going to be IW 401, that's this session, that's Jennifer and I. 402 is Matt and I with the workflow. 403 is Matt and Jennifer. And then 404, Dervish and I are going to be doing all the reporting part. So we're going to take Microsoft products and things that are integrated with SharePoint and show you several different ways that we can report off of that travel request solution that we've built. So we've got SSRS, performance point, KPIs, and just sort of, we're going to highlight the different things and then why you would use different ways of creating reports.
Yeah, and as we're going through this session, it's important to kind of note, like a travel request system, and it's going to have approval. If there's 50 different companies in here, I guarantee you we probably have 50 different ways that we would have to route the approval for a travel request. So for a solution like this, it's more important that you just kind of understand the concepts and see where we're going with things and see how things fit together, so that when you get back to your office, you can take it and you can tweak this information and make it match your very specific policy. So we're going to be showing you things inside of SharePoint, but everything we show you is customizable. So we might have one approval process. It doesn't mean that if you don't have the same approval process that you can't implement it. It just means that you have to take it and apply some of the same techniques and tweak it to fit your individual needs.
Right, and the key here is that that's what we're teaching you, is we're teaching you how to take this and make it your own, and kind of little gotchas here and there, and how you do things and how you might not want to do things maybe, and just sort of the best ways to go about it. So here's some of the components that we're going to be dealing with today. Of course, we have SharePoint in the middle. SharePoint Designer is what we're going to use mostly for the workflows part, and a little bit of data view web parts later on in that 4th session. We have InfoPath, which we're going to be using today, and then of course a task list is a big part, and we put it as a separate component because of the way that a workflow works. When it creates tasks out, it's a whole separate task list from the actual form itself. And then we have reporting tools, which are several different tools that we're going to go over in that last session. All right, let's get on with the meat of it. Okay, so.
All right, so the first thing we're looking at is our process. And so when you're starting with anything that you're going to be automating inside of SharePoint, you need to start at the very beginning. And we need to understand what is being approved and routed. We need to understand from start to finish what we're trying to do, because if you don't, you're going to end up with pieces at the end that, how do we know the process is complete? What are the different components? And one thing I'll say about SharePoint is if I cannot write it down on paper and get a clear business process, putting it into SharePoint is not going to make it a clear business process. Okay, so SharePoint is great for highlighting. Actually, if you have a broken business process and you try to put it into SharePoint, you're going to have a highlighted broken process. So you want to look and make sure that whatever you're implementing has a clear process behind it, and you're able to map it out using flowcharts. You're able to map it out, building out the workflow and get everyone to agree that this is what we're building. So again, I love it when I go to sessions and I hear people say that. I think in my head, you've got to be kidding me, because that's not the real world, because in the real world we don't have 100% complete business processes. We have broken business processes.
Right, you get those people, those business people in a room together, and you get them to fight it out and draw it on a whiteboard and figure out what their process actually is, because different people have different interpretations of that.
And it also doesn't mean that you cannot implement it into SharePoint. It just means you need to be prepared for it, and you need to know what you're implementing. So you may implement a business process that, we're automating 90% of it and 10% of it is still manual, because that's kind of the process and we don't know what we're doing. In terms of automating it, if we don't know the process yet, we can't really automate it. So maybe there's some pieces of it that still need to be manual. And so it's perfectly fine to implement those into SharePoint as long as everyone goes into it with an open mindset that says, okay, this is clearly what we're implementing. These are the unknowns, and this is how we're going to address the unknowns in the solution so that we can still build a solution, but we're accounting for all of the pieces. So kind of go into it with your eyes wide open to see, okay, what are we implementing? What are all of the components?
So what is the one thing that's being routed around? Mm-hmm. So in some cases, it's a document that people need to approve. In this case, it's going to be an actual InfoPath form that's going through an approval process. So you have the thing that's being routed and approved. Then you have tasks that potentially need to be assigned to people as that thing is routed around. The emails that get sent, so that's another one of those things to define at the beginning. So not only send an email to the manager when it's time for them to approve, but what does that email need to say? Define, get the business to define the verbiage for you as to what exactly that means. And then one of the things that people tend to overlook when the business comes to you with a form and they say, put this in a web form for you, a lot of the times they forget about the user interface. So that's mostly what Jennifer and Matt are going to be talking about, but that's that. Sometimes it's like pulling teeth talking to the business about this. Okay, so when people fill out a form, where does it go? Like, what do they see after they filled out the form? Do they have permissions to the item still? Do they see a list of forms that they've submitted? How do they get to it later? What are the web parts going to be on the site? So the user interface is another one of those things to think through at the very beginning.
Yeah, and the more you can think about it in the beginning, the more you can help your users understand where you're going with the solution. You can build the most technically complete solution, but if your users can't go to the page and simply use it, they're probably not going to use it. So sometimes you can build a much simpler solution and put more emphasis on the UI, and you're going to get better user adoption just because it's easy to use and they can navigate and find what they're looking for. So we want to make sure that in the beginning, you plan for that and understand how are they expecting to interact with this form.
Okay, so I skipped over one. Okay, so requirements. So again, get a flow chart together like we touched on a few minutes ago. Ask them about security restrictions. So again, like I mentioned, when someone fills out a form, where does it go and do they have access to it later, and what specific people might need to be given access to it? Because you have sort of two different ideas about security in SharePoint. You can just sort of have security by obfuscation, like say I'm just going to put this over in this list, and they don't necessarily have a view where they can see all the items in the list. They can just see their own, but the items aren't necessarily secure with SharePoint security. And then you have actual cases where you need to say the workflow needs to assign actual SharePoint permissions to the item as soon as it's submitted, so that only certain people can access it. So there's security by hiding it, and then there's security by actual real
and these are the types of things that you want to understand in the beginning, because as you guys have worked with SharePoint, how many of you guys are familiar with some of the pain with item level security? So item level permissions in SharePoint are painful, they're hard to manage, and they quickly become out of control. So if you're working with a form, and let's say in the beginning we think security is for everybody, and then we realize later we're adding this extra step at the very end, and now we have a list with 150 items with item level security. It becomes very difficult to manage. Whereas if we would have thought of that in the beginning and we would have had that conversation, we might have been putting those forms into different libraries and doing security at the library level. So the security question really has some design impacts, and the sooner you can know that, the better, so that you can design for the solution so that you don't make it more complex than it needs to be.
All right, and then again, get the verbiage of the emails, what they need to say. Find out about task assignment. Do you want people to actually have a task assigned to them, or do you just want to send an email to them and say it's time for you to go approve such and such? And then define what happens at the end. So once the form is done, do you lock it down to read-only? What exactly happens to it? Does it get archived somewhere else? How long does it stay in the library? So kind of think through all these things, and that's just more to ask.
We have an example right now of a process that's running at a bank, and a lot of people are going in, they're completing the form, and it's something that all employees complete on a regular basis. So there's thousands of these forms around. And we've been telling them through the entire process, okay, we need to know when this ends, and we need to clean up the libraries, and we need to keep everything restricted so that we don't end up with too many list items. And we've been trying to have this conversation for several months now, and last week they called me, and lo and behold, they hit the threshold error because they haven't answered this question to figure out. So are you guys familiar inside of SharePoint with the list level? If you have too many items in a view, you're going to get a threshold error, and the page is going to come up and say, the items in this list are past the threshold, you cannot view the items. So sure enough, they hit that, but the data that's in the list isn't really active data that needs to have anything done with it. And so, telling them and telling them and telling them, and now they're like, I think we need to clean that up. So this is, one of the potential things that you could run into when you're using the forms and working with the forms if you don't complete the process to say, okay, when do we know this is complete? And it's one of those things that, users are going to get a strange error, and it's just going to take a little bit of time to clean up. So definitely want to know in the beginning, how do we know this is complete and where is it going once it's done?
Right, and also just kind of the simple fact that you don't want people to be able to go edit a form if it's already completed and it's been approved, and you want it to be locked down and controlled, things like that. All right, so first we have a demo of our actual travel site. We're going to show you, so we have the travel request library already built, and we're going to go ahead and just show you what the form looks like already built, and then we're going to start from scratch and build the form. So I'm going to go to now you'll notice the site is very blank here. This is because we're starting from scratch, and we're going to build this whole solution as we go throughout the day. And so mostly the web parts are going to get put on here when we get to the UI part and when we get to Jennifer and Matt's session later.
And a little bit about our environment. So you kind of heard Steve in the keynote talk about how we've all been collaborating together. Well, that's just beautiful.
There we go.
Since we're all working across a couple different countries and many different time zones, we were using Office 365 to collaborate on our solution. So this entire solution is built out using Office 365. So we are dependent on the internet for our demos, and I don't know if any of you guys present, but that's like a presenter's worst nightmare, to be dependent on the internet, but that's where we're at. So we've got that there. So if you notice anything that's a little bit different and say, oh, well, my implementation doesn't look like that, I don't know, how many of you guys are familiar with Office 365? Okay, so good. Are any of you guys running fully on Office 365? Okay, cool. There's a couple of different things, like when you're adding web parts and stuff like that, the interfaces are different. But for the most part, everything's going to be the same. But just a note, in case you see any differences, if you see something and you're not sure if it's different because of Office 365 or something like that, please go ahead and ask a question. Oh, Matt's shaking his head at me.
He already has a question.
Yes, sir.
We can ask questions as you go.
Yes,
Yes,
go for it.
absolutely.
I was intrigued that you had the SharePoint Workspace logo.
Yes, that is because it's Office 365. It has a different logo on the site. That's one of the...
Okay, so it's nothing particular about...
No, that's just
the logo that Office 365 uses as their default. It's very odd, but whatever. Also, a note on versioning. How many people are using Enterprise? Hopefully, almost everyone in the room. Okay. So the solution that we're showing is using InfoPath and InfoPath Form Services. So SharePoint Enterprise, you would need to be licensed to do all of the things that we're doing.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and fill this out, pick my department, make something up. And you can see we just have this a simple idea of a travel request and, saying when you're going somewhere, where you're going, and SharePoint conference. All right, learning. There we go. And that's going to be, I'll just make up some stuff here. Okay. I'm not very creative. All right, so I just filled out my form and submitted it. So I really just wanted to show you what the form is that we're building and what it looks like, and we're going to go ahead and start from scratch in a little bit and create that and go through that whole process. Any questions about the form itself? Okay, and as we said a second ago, just feel free. This is, yes?
Is there any documentation you can take away today, or do we just have to wait for the DVD in X weeks?
Is there any documentation that you take away today? Our slides, but I don't know when they're going to be out. I don't know of any. None of the sessions have actual handouts or anything like that. If that's what you're asking.
You can tweet us though, and we'll kind of point you to the right direction for certain parts of it, not the whole thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it is kind of hard to see the people in the back, so you might have to say something if I don't see you raising your hand. The lights are kind of bright. All right. Okay, so we're going to talk, these are the fundamentals that you're going to learn today about InfoPath. So first, I showed you filling out the form, so we're going to go through creating the form, talk about form layouts, like visually putting things on the page, what are form controls, data sources, and then how to publish the form. And then we're going to go through, connections and submitting connections and receiving connections and a little bit more advanced stuff towards the end. All right.
All right, so when you go into InfoPath and you go to create a form, you can create one from a SharePoint list. That would be when you have an existing SharePoint list and you want to customize it, versus if you have a form library and you want people to submit the form library. So you have two different options when you're doing that. You can pick up there. And then you can do some of the advanced form templates. So inside of SharePoint, you know how when you create a template, it's just giving you all of the components that they think you need with that you're going to use. So when I create a team site, it gives me a document library, it gives me a list. Versus if I create a blog template, it's going to give me a post library, and it's going to give me the things that are relative to a blog. The same thing with the templates you can do for InfoPath. So if I pick one with a database, it's going to give me all of the components I need to connect to a database. Web services, data connection file, all of those. It's not to say that you can't do all of those components without that. It just means you need to activate different features and turn things on so that you can use them.
Right. A lot of these advanced form templates are just certain types of data connections that even if you use the SharePoint form library and start there, which is what I typically do, you can still add these other types of data connections later into the library. So I rarely, if ever, start with one of these other types of connections. And then, of course, if you're still on SharePoint 2007, you have the ability to just use a template that's going to be compatible, and you're going to be able to publish it to SharePoint 2007. So you are still able to use InfoPath 2010 even if your company's only on SharePoint 2007, and I highly recommend that. So I highly recommend using the InfoPath 2010 Designer client because it's just much better of a design experience than InfoPath 2007. All right, so when we get to form layouts, we're going to pick a page template layout first, and I'll show you that when we start demoing this. And then these are sort of little subtables that it gives you that you can pick from. And this is just visually, what is it going to look like on the screen and how are you going to arrange the fields.
Yeah, and you can see, I don't know how well you guys can see from the back, but the dark box is going to be the label, and then the white box is going to be the fields. So some are on top of each other and some are next to each other. So that visual design lets you know, how do I want to arrange the form. So again, you can do it all manually once you build the form and you can pick it. But if you kind of know the general idea of how you want your form to be laid out, these can be very helpful.
Right, you're always going to have the ability to just manually insert a table into your form and just do it from scratch, but these are just sort of, they're helping you out with little ideas and color schemes there. Okay, so what do we start with? The business has handed us some sort of form and they say make this electronic, so it's usually going to look, something like this, or just, it's going to have logical sections to it usually though, right? So you're going to have like, this one has got, it's a claims form, so it's got claim information, employee information, employer. It doesn't really matter if you can't see what all the fields are. It's just the general idea of the fact that it's got logical sections already, and they usually do. So you're going to take the logical sections that they've already shown you in their existing form, and you're going to take that and apply it to your InfoPath form. So you're going to organize not only visually the way it looks, but we can also organize the fields when we start building those out, and we'll show you that too. All right, so know what each field type is. So again, this is an example of a different form that the business might have handed you that was an Excel form. So a lot of these cases that the business person that handed me this, they knew what some of these were, like a drop-down list. She indicated that. Some of them, if it says such and such date, completed, canceled, does that need to be a date? Does that need to be a drop-down? It's got date, contract, completed. I know that needs to be a date field, but if you're not sure, that's one of those things you need to find out from them ahead of time and just find out what type of field it needs to be. Does it need to be a number or currency or text?
Yeah, you can spend a lot of time redoing forms if you don't get this done first. So the more you can do of this in the beginning, the less time you're going to have in your development cycle. So you always hear the more we can plan, the more we can design, the less time we're going to spend developing. It's very true inside of InfoPath, because if I have fields, then I have to change certain fields. I may have to delete fields, add others, rename them. Then I have to clean up and make sure I don't have too many fields in the form that aren't really being used. So there's a lot of value in doing all of this before you ever open InfoPath.
I mean, a lot of the times, a lot of them they all just look like text boxes. So how are you supposed to know it's supposed to be a number?
Right.
I just need to tell you. Oops. Okay. So I think I just double click that. Okay. So I'll go ahead and start the demo of a new form with the layout and the fields. So I'm going to InfoPath Designer 2010. When they created InfoPath 2010, they split it into two different products. It's got Designer and it's got Filler. So when your company is deploying Office, they can pick and choose if they'd like and only deploy InfoPath Designer to people who they want to actually be designing forms, and they can deploy Filler to people who will be filling them out. Of course, with browser-based forms, most of the time you don't even necessarily need to have Filler because people are filling out browser-based forms, and that's 99% of the forms that I do personally is browser-based. Not many people want people to have the client on their computer.
In 2007, there were a lot more functionality and features in InfoPath that you couldn't get in the browser. So there was more of a business case of if I needed a form to behave a certain way, I had to use the client versus the browser. In 2010, most of those have been resolved. So it's pretty much the same with what you can use in the browser and what you can use as the client, with a few exceptions. So there's not nearly as many business cases that would cause people to have to depend on the client.
I'm going to start with a SharePoint form library, which is what I usually do. Just again, the SharePoint list, it gives you the same sort of idea, the same sort of interface that you get with a form library, but a SharePoint list, I like to say they kind of dumb down the interface a little bit. So like for people who are used to using InfoPath and been using it for years, there are a lot of things when you're using a SharePoint list that are grayed out, menu items that are missing, things that you simply can't do. And so it's really very, very simplified. So in our InfoPath book, I wrote an entire chapter, chapter 2, it's a decision matrix. So when you first decide you need to create a form, how do you know what to do here? Is it a SharePoint list? Is it a form library? So what are all the different factors involved? So it's a pretty extensive list of things to think about, but usually I land on a SharePoint form library. So they give you this nice, pretty little table and interface to kind of give you an idea to get started, because back in older versions of InfoPath, it was just a big blank screen, and people would just start throwing fields on there. So I think that they decided to try it and start give you a hint that you can arrange things with a table. First thing I usually do is delete that. Because
I do the same.
Right. I don't like to just start from scratch. So I can go, what I do, and I don't go to the Insert tab first, I go to the Page Design tab, but because they have this Page Layout Templates option that I like to start with, and it gives me sort of the whole template for the form, and within that template, I can insert my just other little tables. So
and one of the benefits of using these predefined layouts that you get because I can always go in and say insert a table and insert my own custom table, but if we want the themes to be applied so that I can quickly build a table and then one day they want it green, the next day they want it pink, maybe the form needs to change with the seasons, whatever your end users want, you want to be able to quickly change that and take advantage of the features that are inside of InfoPath. So by picking the layouts that exist, the themes are going to be auto-applied to those layouts.
Right, and it even said, it had a little verbiage that said add tables, so it's giving you a hint. Yes? Can you customize the colors? Yes. Yes, and we'll do that in a second too. All right, so within this section, I'm going to go ahead and go to the Insert tab, and this is the screenshot that we showed on that last slide that gives you some ideas as to what you can insert here. So I'm just going to go ahead and pick, let's see, this one looks nice right here. So once you do that, it's got, they have different shading and little things like that. I like to play around and try a few each time. So this is where you can have your logical sections of your form though. So I inserted that there, and then I can say, well, my next logical section, I'll insert it down here, and that's how you can sort of delineate between them. And then the next thing that you do is you can go to the Page Design tab and hear all those color themes. Now, they have a lot of color themes. So I like LSU, which is the college that I went to. Those are the colors, so I could pick that. Or, you know, I could pick purple. So you have a lot of different ones you can choose from. You don't have to pick these, though. You could, if you wanted to, spend a lot of time doing it yourself, you know, color each individual cell the way you want it to and make it your own. But they give you a lot of choices here. So you want to stick with purple? What do you want? Does that sound good?
Whatever works for you, Laura.
Okay. Okay, so then we have our logical sections. So we have traveler info. And then we have the trip information. And those are our visual sections here. So also we have our fields. So we have kind of different ways that we like to go about this. We all have our sort of preferences as to where we begin when we start creating a form. I like to go over here and I right click on my fields and I add my logical sections to match up with the sections that I have in the form. Traveler info, and I create this as a group. So that's a group is sort of like a folder full of fields. So I create this as a group, and then I'm going to put all the traveler information fields inside of that group, and I'll just go ahead and create the trip information too. Oops, info. All right. And so what I do is I go over here and create all the fields, and then I start placing them on the form. Jennifer?
That's not at all what I do. I go back to the Home tab, and I drag all of my fields. So you have the controls here, and you can pick the fields that you want, and you can drag them onto the SharePoint form. So I will drag them onto the form, and then I'll go through the process of renaming all of them because I just personally find that easier, and it's my preference for doing it. So Laura and I kind of laugh whenever we do this session because we definitely work different in InfoPath. You can open a form and know when she created it and when I created it. We get the same end results, but a little different process to get there. So, I mean, that says a lot about SharePoint. There's probably 1,000,002 ways to do everything. So, you know, neither way is necessarily right or wrong. You just have to find a way that's to your preference and be consistent about it and still follow the best practices. So at the end of the day, Laura and I agree that the best practices are your form fields should be labeled properly and they should be grouped together and they should be easy to find. Based on what you're trying to do. So we end up with a different path to get to the same spot, but that's at the end of the day what the best practice is.
Right, so I'll show you some examples of what that looks like. So this, let's see, this little table that I inserted, it's kind of lopsided, so they put the divider sort of towards the left. I'm going to drag this over here and make it sort of even here. And there are a few different things to go over. So there are the fields compared to the actual controls that you're adding on the form. So when I put my cursor in this box up here and I click text box, it immediately just puts a text box here, but it calls it field 1, and it just sticks it randomly, not randomly, but at the bottom of whatever the list of fields is over here. So that's just one thing that I have to keep in mind is that when I start adding controls like this and clicking text box, it's just going to keep numbering them field 1 through whatever. But the optional way of doing it is I go over here and I click add under traveler info and I say traveler name and I make that a text box. But when you do it this way, when you start dragging them and you see these names called field 1, field 2, then you just have to know to go over here to fields later and rename them.
Yeah, and I usually rename them as soon as I get them, as soon as I get the basic layout of the form done, so I'm happy with it and I know what it is, and I go through and I label and name everything. Did you have a question over here? Yes, sir.
Thank you. Content types, predefined. I assume we can select them. And what happens if you manage content types in your, let's call it the content type outside collection? When you change that one there, what happens to the form?
So he's asking about content types and how it relates to the fields in here. When you're going to deal with content types, you're usually, and this is going to go towards more the part where we go through the publishing process. So when you publish your form, you can publish it as a content type. But as you're going through the publishing wizard and you're promoting your columns, that's when you're going to pick each column and which ones you need to become columns in SharePoint. And if the site columns already exist, those are the ones that you can select from to match up an existing field with a site column. That's kind of way ahead of what we're doing right now. But Changing the content type.
Yeah, if you change it, so the way that the content type hub works is that you're going to have all of your fields and everything in the content type, and you're going to have your form. The form is actually not something that gets auto-published down to all of the sites that are consuming it. So you would have to update your form, and then whatever process you're using to get that form out to all of the site collections using it, you'd have to follow that. So if you change the columns, you would have to reopen the form and then go through whatever process you did to get that activated on all of the site collections so that they have access to the form as well as the fields.
Right, fields are not automatically going to show up on your form at any point.
So you'd have to update the form and go through the process again.
Makes sense at the end of the day. It's better to follow it.
Yeah.
All right, so what I want to illustrate is the difference between the fields and the controls here. So I can take my traveler name control field and I can drag it. Now, one thing to note though, when I drag it, you can see as I drag it across here, it highlights two cells next to each other. And when I see that highlighting both cells, if I let go of it then, it puts the name of the field over here and the text box over on the right. Alternately, if I take traveler name and I drag it and until I just see the cursor in that one cell and then I let go of it, then it keeps it all together in one cell. And so that's just your visual preference. Personally, I think that I can save a lot more real estate when I put the field like this instead of having the name way over here and the text box way over here. But it's just a different way. It's just visually what your preference is. So here, now I have field 1, field 2, and I have traveler name, which I had already created. But I want to clean this up, and I want to go ahead and delete these fields. Deleting a field does not delete the controls that you've put on the form that are associated with that field. So I can go ahead and delete field 2, and now I have just these text boxes floating out here that are unbound, and it gives me a little error saying that they're unbound. So I can delete this traveler name control, and it does not delete the field. So again, there are two separate entities. Now I can take this text box that I already placed on the form, and I'm going to bind it. So that's what ties together your controls and your fields. So I can right-click on this unbound text box, and I can say Change Binding. And that's when I can say, I want this text box to be the traveler name.
This is one of the #1 things we find when we're working with people in InfoPath is that they spend so much time in a form and they make so many changes that at the end of the day they have many fields in the field control that aren't on the form and vice versa. So it's one of the things that you can really help yourself out by keeping it as clean as possible and not leaving it to the very end. To get everything organized and nice and neat, but as you're going along the way, develop those practices where you're cleaning up the form, you're naming all of the fields, and you're putting everything where it should be from the beginning. You'll be thankful in the end when you do it that way.
All right, so while she was talking, I went ahead and just went through here and created a few more fields. But so I can take this other unbound one, and I can say I want to bind it to the department field. And then again, another way of dragging things on is I can take this date field, and since when I created it over here, I made it a data type of a date. So again, you have different data types that you can pick whenever you're creating these, a date or a number, whatever it happens to be. And so it's going to know that when I take request date and put it over here, that it needs to be a date picker. So it's going to understand that. Now with drop downs, it's going to be a little different because a drop down is not a field type. So it's still going to be either text or a number or a date or whatever it is, but a drop-down is really a visual control. So when you're creating your fields over here, you're not going to see drop-down box in the data type option.
Right. But you do see it up in the control section. So it's just that they pre-configure it for you. So again, it becomes your preference as to which one you want to use.
So if I've already put my department field on here as a text box, I can either delete this text box and re-add it as a drop-down list, or I can just right-click on my department field and change control, and I can change it to a drop-down list. And that's how I can quickly just switch things around without having to delete a field and re-add a field and delete the field over here and add the control, and it gets to be a big mess.
They make it very easy for you to work with the form from multiple different directions. If you have something and they need to change it to something else, usually there's some menu structure that you can follow to quickly convert it.
Right, so again, if I take this, my cursor, and I put text box here, it puts an empty box. And you know, to what Jennifer was saying a minute ago about these fields and how they can get so messy over here, I saw one. I used to work in healthcare, and a physical therapist decided that she was going to create a form in InfoPath so when she sees all of her patients, she can fill out this great big long form about all the different, you know, modalities and things she's doing when she's doing physical therapy. Well, she created a great form, but she didn't know anything about this field pane over here. And so she was labeling them over here, like typing a word over each box, but it wasn't necessarily renaming the fields over here. And we had field 1, field 2, field 3, through about field 400 over there. It was a huge mess. So, and the problem of that is that she had already published it and people had already started filling out the form. You can't go in here and organize it later, rearrange fields, put them in the right little folders, or change their names after it's been published and people are filling it out, because you'll lose that. You'll lose the data. So that's really important that all this gets organized in the field pane before you publish it and start using it. All right, so I'll go ahead and delete field 3 here. And again, I'm going to rebind this little lost little text box and put that with my phone field. All right, and then this drop down is my department. So I have traveler name, request date, department, phone. And then for my department, I have a drop down box. So for the drop down box, I can get to the properties. Every single control on here is going to have an extra property screen that you can pull up. So when I double click that control, it takes me to this properties tab in the contextual ribbon. And another little shortcut to know is that if I quickly want to just open up the property screen, I can do Alt-Enter on any of these controls, and that will pull up my properties page. And so a lot of the same things on this property page are things that you're going to see in the ribbon too. So for the properties for my department drop down, I can just quickly type in some choices manually. If I type them in manually, then this means if this list of things ever needs to change, then someone's going to actually have to go into the form, change the manual options, and then republish the form. So this is going to, and we're going to talk a little bit more about data connections in a little bit, but this is going to be a case where you'd want to go create a SharePoint list with all the departments. And that way you can refer to that list, and maybe you can have several different forms that all have a drop-down list of departments, and they all refer to that same, use that same SharePoint list as their data connection. And that way you're not manually typing and having to go edit each different form. So I'll go ahead and do that. Let's see, IT. I'm just going ahead. I'm manually typing them just for now. And as we're developing the form, we can always go hit this preview button. So on our home tab, we have a big preview button, but in our little quick shortcut tab area up here at the top, we have this little green checkbox. You can test it as you go. Another thing for default values, so request date, I want that to be the date that they're actually filling this out. So every different field is going to give you the ability to put a default value in that field. So since I want to have the default value be today, whatever date they're filling it out, I can actually use a function called today. So I have this little function box. I can insert function, and I can go look at all of them I want, and I can go find today. It's in the date section. And that way I can default it to today. Now this checkbox is really important, right, Jennifer?
Yes.
If I leave this box checked, that means every time somebody opens up the form, the date is going to refresh and change to whatever that other day is. So if you want this to be the request date, the date they first filled it out, and you don't want it to change, it's really important that you uncheck that box. So now I can see when I preview it, it fills in the correct date there. And I could even go one step forward, and I can make this so it's a read-only box so they can't change it. One thing, though, to note is that since I made this a date data type here, it is not a date and time data type. It is a date data type. I'm using the today function. So if I use a date data type, I'm going to use the today function as my default. If I use a date and time data type, I want to use now as my default. It's not, you're going to get an error if you use the wrong function with, with the wrong data type there.
Do you guys have any questions so far on filling out the form? Yes.
Currently, you have no association between this and SharePoint.
Correct.
Right, we have not published it yet.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in date format in particular. It's a small thing, but when that's connected to my SharePoint with my regional settings, I want that on my InfoPath in European format. Go into that later.
Yeah, so the date and time, I believe it's pulling from the server, like the settings on the computer. So I think, isn't it, Laura? From
Right.
Yeah, so it should be in the right format for whatever you're using.
Need the designer or the form filler?
Well, then when it goes to the form, it's going to go to the server. So again, it would be configured based on
Right.
when
Well,
they
this is
access
an
it.
Office product, so whatever formatting you have, like when you install Office and you have the
Right.
languages or those regional settings and things like that in your Office suite. So this is going to be part. It's going to be part of whatever you set up for your Office suite. So it's going to get those.
Being the form designer,
Mm-hmm.
if I've got US format, I'd be redoing it all in US format, but then I'd publish it to my SharePoint. No? And then the
It's going to
users will
pull,
be-
if you're in the browser, it's going to pull from whatever the server is set to. So the regional settings on the server.
Okay, so what I'm saying here is absolutely definitive of the actual use case. When the user's using it, it could be slightly different.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm probably not going to put an absolutely definitive on that, but we can look at it for sure, and I can get you an absolutely definitive, but it's my understanding that it should be based on what the server is. So if they're filling it out on the client, it's going to pull whatever their client settings are, but when I'm filling it out on SharePoint, I'm running a service that's on the server, so it's going to pull from whatever the server settings are. So we can I'm definitely happy to follow up with you on that and get you the definitive answer, but that's the one. Laura, does that sound?
Yeah, we'd have to research that.
Yeah. I think there were some other questions. Yes.
So you've got a departments list that you put it manually there, that you could pull from a list. What about management metadata in SharePoint?
Oh, such a wonderful question. InfoPath does not support the managed metadata column type. So anything that you have inside of managed metadata cannot be customized inside of InfoPath. So there's really no workaround for it. It just kind of is the way that it is. I agree. It is painful, and I'm sorry.
I was wondering if you found a clutch or somewhere around it.
No, and I understand why it doesn't work technically. I understand why, because of the way that they're storing the managed metadata. How many of you guys are familiar with what we're talking about when we say managed metadata? Okay, great. So it's the column that's based off of the type managed metadata, and you can store things in the term set and term stores and different things like that. That column does not work inside of InfoPath, so you cannot take from an InfoPath and publish it to that column type. And if you have a SharePoint list and you customize it in InfoPath, all of the columns will come over except for the managed metadata column. So it's just one of the limitations of the managed metadata. It's a good question. Yes, sir?
If we develop our own custom field,
If you develop your own custom what?
well, just a field.
Custom fields, we're talking about developer stuff, Jennifer.
We are. I don't know the answer on the custom fields.
Because we had issue, a different type of issue, not InfoPath issue, with management data. And we did quite a workaround. So
You might be able to find a workaround, but I don't know that I'd recommend rewriting the managed metadata to make it custom. So yeah, so I don't know.
There's some web service stuff that you can do. Like I played around a little bit with not the metadata, but the tagging. I think they both have web services that you can tap into. So I played with the tagging one time, and I was able to go in and get my InfoPath form to pull from using the tagging web service. It's like a social. It's called social something.asmx. And I was able to do a little bit of that, but it was very painful and very complicated. But there
Yeah.
could be something you could do with that.
So my question is a little bit more generic. Any custom field that we develop,
I think it's going to depend. It's going to fully depend on whatever the base of that custom field is. So until we know more about it, we can't really give you an answer. I think it's going to be a big ol' it depends, which is pretty much the answer to anything custom you develop, and how is it going to integrate with SharePoint. It depends.
Okay, so I'm going to point something out here before I add event type on here. So mostly everything that we've had on here, we've got some text boxes, we've got some date fields. Event type is going to be a radio button, so there are some important things to understand about how radio buttons work. So I put my cursor in the area where I want to put my radio button, and I can actually do this little drop down on event type here, and I can pick, and this is just another way of adding fields to the form. There are always several ways. So I can pick option button like this, and then when I do that, it asks me how many different option buttons I want. So I pick 3. Now all 3 option buttons are going to be all tied with event type as their field. And it just gives me 3 buttons that are, they're empty. There's nothing next to it. So I want to put, what, conference, training, and client. So conference, training, client, and this is going to be, I got to put my field name, so event type, like that. Now that I've put the 3 radio buttons on here, as you can see, when I click on each one, they're all tied to event type. But now I need to define the actual data that's going to get stored in the event type field. So I'm going to go ahead and open up, so I can click Control Properties up here, or I can do, again, that shortcut Alt-Enter. So by default, the value when this is selected, it's just going to put numbers in here. So if someone picked conference and they submitted this form, their conference field would say 1 in it. So we want this to say conference. So value when selected is going to be conference, and then I can say training. And then for this other one, client. And just be sure not to change the field name when you do that, because the field name needs to stay event type for all 3. I accidentally change the field name all the time when I do this.
It doesn't work well.
And then you can even define whether one of these is going to be selected by default. So does that make sense? So all 3 of these are tied to that field. You just have to define what the value is when it's stored in there. Okay. All right, so I'm going to just kind of save this as I go. So I'll save this just to my desktop here. And let's see, I'll call it travel demo. And this is an XSN file. So as you're developing your form, this is your form template, and it's going to be an XSN file type. We're going to go through the publishing it to SharePoint. When people actually fill this form out and submit it, that field type is going to be an XML file. So all the filled out forms are XML files, and they all need to, throughout the life of an XML file, it always needs to understand where its XSN template is, so that all those files in a form library in SharePoint are going to sort of be tied to whatever XSN file you use to be able to publish them. All right, so I've gone over, field types, controls, putting them on the form. We can go over, we're going to go over some rules a little bit later, and that way we can go do a little bit with some validation rules and things like that. But I'm going to clean up this little empty row here. And any questions about the actual fields and the controls before we go to the next slide? Okay. All right.
Yes, go ahead.
The traveller name, can that be pulled in straight from AD so they don't have to type their name in?
Yes, and we're gonna try to get to that towards the end, and we're gonna make that a people picker. We're gonna try and make that default to the currently logged in user. So it's one of those things that we save towards the end. So we're gonna try to get that, have time to do that part.
Yeah, the way that you put the smarts into the form is through what's called data connections. And so I think the very next thing we're going to be looking at doing is submitting it to the SharePoint library. Is that next?
I think so, yes.
And then after that, then we go back and look at the data connections.
Are you aiming that the data you're filling in is ultimately going to end up in the SharePoint list, or it will never go into SharePoint list?
No, it's going to go in a SharePoint list.
SharePoint library, same,
Yeah.
same concept.
No.
Well, they're all going to be columns in the library.
Columns in the library?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is it possible to create something here which will be impossible to put into SharePoint?
Which would be impossible.
Yeah. Or is it something everything you're able to do will ultimately fit into SharePoint?
Yes.
Depending.
Everything we're doing is going to fit into
In your
SharePoint.
demo, yeah, but
Well, like there's certain things, like if you take a repeating,
yeah.
if you're doing like a repeating table or something like that in InfoPath, you can't directly say, take everything in this repeating table and make it a single column or something. I mean, there's some ways that you can do it, but not all the same. So yes, there are some things that you can put in an InfoPath form that will not go directly to a column in a SharePoint list. But that shouldn't really impact, that should just be part of the design, I guess. It shouldn't really impact the solution. You should be able to design around that with your solution if you need to use those controls.
So when she's talking about a repeating table, so that's just one control that we don't happen to have on the form, so I'll just show you what that is real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and select this control type up here. So these are containers. So a repeating table is a container. So if you had something like an expense report, where people had multiple items as part of their expense report that they needed to go and associate with it, like a table of information, I can put what's called a repeating table in here, and that way I could say like expense type. I'm just kind of making this up as I go with expense stuff. Expense type, cost, cost center, something like that. So your repeating table, when you fill out the form, so I'll go ahead and show you what that would look like. So I can go expense type. I'm just going to put some test information. And see, I can insert another item. I don't know if y'all can see this if it's at the very bottom of the screen, but I can keep inserting rows inside of this repeating table. So repeating tables are actually something very tricky when you're dealing with InfoPath as to where they go. Because first of all, when you do a SharePoint list form in InfoPath, you don't even have repeating table as an option, because this is a table inside of a table, really.
Right.
And
so you can do things like when I publish back to SharePoint, I can do things like get a total of, or I can get a merge, which will take all of the columns together if it's a text column and merge them into a single field. So you can see how that could get very sloppy depending on the number of items you have. So there's certain cases where you could have this and it won't publish one-to-one, but I could have a total field on my cost and then I just publish my cost up. So that's kind of where I say you can design around it. If you need to use the repeating table, that's probably a case where every field in your form doesn't necessarily need to be a column in your library. So that's one of the ways that I like to look at when I'm doing a list or if I'm doing a library. If every column doesn't need to be, or if every item in the field in the form doesn't need to be a column in the library, that's a great candidate for a form library, because I can have elements in the form that don't necessarily get published up.
Right, so if the fields that you pick, we're going to go through the publishing wizard in a minute, but the fields that you pick, you can pick and choose which ones need to be columns, and those are the ones that you need to be able to sort and filter by, you need to be able to do reporting off of, you need to be able to have views in your list of those fields. If you have a form that's got 100 fields and you only have certain important ones that you need people to be able to see and sort and filter in the list, those are the ones that you can promote. So you can still have repeating tables and big like notes fields and all these extra things that you don't necessarily push up to SharePoint, because people can simply open the form up and see all that data inside the form.
Did you have a question?
Can you have fields associated with the event times, depending on the event type you pick?
Yes. So you do that inside of InfoPath, and we don't have a lot of examples around that, but you would do that through the use of sections. And then I would have, like, let's say I had a section for conference, then I would make the section hidden unless they select conference. And then if they select conference, I would show the section and they would fill in those specific things. So you'd use the sections inside of InfoPath to build that logic in there.
Right,
Yeah.
we're going to try and get to that when we go to form the rules. Towards the end, we're going to build a new field that's just for the client. So when they pick a client as the event type, they're going to have another field they have to fill in. So we're going to try and get to that. All right. So we went over controls. Those are all the different types of controls you can have. And then the inputs are actually things that people fill out and select. And then containers are things like a repeating table and a section like she was talking about, where you can visually group things together on the form. Objects are going to be things like buttons, picture buttons, hyperlinks, things that it's not storing data in it. It's just something that someone is interacting with on the form. And then again, containers like repeating tables and optional sections. Okay, so I already did the difference. While I was in there, I already showed the difference between fields and controls, and I showed you the control settings. When you can do Alt-Enter, and you can look at the settings for every single control that you've put on the form. And so the next big step is to go through the publishing part. So there are kind of two concepts to think about with the form going to SharePoint. So you have the concept of publishing the form to SharePoint so it then exists in a library. And then you have the concept of people actually filling it out and submitting it to SharePoint. Now you would think that those would be all one and the same, but publishing a form to a SharePoint library doesn't automatically give you the ability for people to fill it out and submit it to the SharePoint library. It's two different sort of
Yeah, so it just associates it. So if I publish a form to a SharePoint library, a user can come along, they can open the form, and then they have the option to do a save. So then they would have to do a file, save as, and put it back to the library. If I want them to be able to go to the form and just hit a button, I have to go through extra steps so that I have that data connection so that when they hit a button, it does that save for them. So when we go through the process of associating this with the form library, the only thing that we're doing is making it available for people to fill it out, but there's still no logic or anything in it that's going to let them automatically save it back to where it came from.
Right. Okay, so publishing to SharePoint, this is what the wizard looks like. You have a few different options when you go through the publishing wizard. You have, first of all, this checkbox that is going to be checked by default that's going to make this a browser-based form, as opposed to people having to have the client on their computer to fill it out. And then you're going to have a form library, site content type, or administrator-approved form template as your different options. So a form library means that when I publish this to a form library, that means the form is attached to that one library, and that is the library people will go to click the new button and fill the form out. If I publish this form as a content type, that means that it then exists at the site level or site collection level as a content type, and it's not in a library, it's not really anywhere yet, it's only a content type. So if you publish it as a content type, you then still have extra steps to go through creating a library, which is where people would go to fill it out, and then associating that content type to the library so that people can go to that library and click the new button to fill it out. And then this third option for administrator approved templates, I don't know about you, but I rarely use this. You have to use this option if you've got custom code in your form, or if your form is trying to look at data kind of, from other systems or other site collections, you're going to be forced to use that option. But this is really, I just usually use form library and just publish it straight to a form library.
Yeah, I do form library or site content type. I do that one a little bit more. Administrator I don't hardly ever use, but I'd venture to say that I don't ever write code that would go inside of InfoPath, nor do I let people. I usually tell them that if you get to the point where you're writing code in InfoPath, you should probably look at other solutions because they're probably going to be a lot less painful. So you can look at doing a custom .NET
Developers
solution
don't like
or something
InfoPath
like that.
typically.
No, they don't. So there's probably another way to get to the same end result if you need to write code in InfoPath. So not saying you shouldn't always do it, just saying that if you get to a point and you think, oh, I have to write code to make this work, then you probably should step back and look at the whole solution and find out and evaluate if InfoPath is even the right tool for it.
So real quick before I answer your question, what does it mean, though, when you do an administrator-approved template? It means that you take your XSN file that it generates, and you have to go over to central administration, or hand it off to someone who has access to central administration, and you have to upload it to the form templates area there, and then you have to activate it to a site collection, which will make it available as a content type, and then you have to go create a form library that will then use that content type. So it's several steps, and every time you change the form, you have to hand it off to the server admin again and go through that process. Yes?
Okay, I have a question about authentication. We tend to access our server from outside the corporate firewall through a proxy server or whatever, and whenever we deal with InfoPath forms, we get prompted for authentication every time we touch the form.
A lot of times when you get prompted for authentication, so he's asking about why does he get prompted for authentication when filling out the form. A lot of times it has to do with browser settings. So is there something, is it only InfoPath forms and not your SharePoint site that's doing this to you?
I believe it's just InfoPath. I think it has something to do with the way that the machine is registered or not registered with the domain that SharePoint's in.
I've never seen that. I mean, I've filled out InfoPath forms for other domains that I wasn't, logged into an actual domain with my computer.
And you're talking about the browser forms, right? The browser forms are giving you there, or the client?
I don't know if it's both or just...
Yeah, the client, it would make sense because if I'm not connected, then anytime I open anything in the client, I'm going to get prompted, whether it's
Excel or
Word, whether it's
anything,
InfoPath. If it's the browser, I'd probably need to go in and dig down and probably put some tracking on to find out where is it losing that authentication. That's not standard behavior. So I can fill out forms not connected to a domain and not get prompted. And that's the behavior that it should be. So if it's not doing that, it would become a troubleshooting effort that we would have to find out why. Yes.
Yes.
You can say we get exactly the same, but it's with any office.
Right, it's the Office
Yeah.
apps, right. If it's the Office apps, then, yeah.
It is to do with what you said, the domain registration of the computer system domain.
And type of authentication and infrastructure settings.
Yes, yeah.
Right, so browser-based forms are not going to give you that behavior, though. Just FYI. But yes, that's a whole server admin thing that's kind of out of the scope of this session. But if it's all the Office products, that means it's your InfoPath client that's trying to do that.
Yes, sir.
If I have a data connection that's pulling information from SQL, where I then publish it using the administrator.
If you have a data connection that's pulling information from SQL, then yes, you're going to need to publish it as an administrator-approved template. Is it like a web service that you wrote for that, or is it?
No, I don't write it.
Oh, okay. Okay, right, yes, that's what you would have to do. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and, let's see.
Go ahead.
Just
Yes.
go through this.
Authentication issue they're talking about, wouldn't that depend on how the authentication was set up? For example, are you using NTLM?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, I think that the answer that we can give you is that that's not typical behavior. If I'm not connected to the domain, but I'm using the browser, as long as I'm in an authenticated domain session or browser session and I hit the form, I should not be prompted for authentication in the browser. So if that's happening, it just means that there is some authentication issue that we have to track down. So it kind of becomes a server admin issue that we have to track down.
Personally, when I'm working with a client site and I'm publishing a form to their domain from my workstation that's not necessarily on their domain, I will get prompted for authentication when I'm going through the publishing wizard. Typically, I'll go into my Internet Explorer options and go into the security settings, and I'll just quickly add that person's domain to my trusted domains, and then I stop getting prompted. So I know that's just kind of a quick fix, but it might be something that you'd want to deploy when you're deploying your IE settings to make that like a trusted location. Do you have a question?
So for extranet users or even internet users, that's not an option.
Right, I agree. It's not necessarily an option for everybody.
This is the level of the platform settings, how we authenticate. It could be web application level as well. So there are different levels of IaaS, platform, firewall, and you just need to get those in sync. That's the answer.
Good,
Right.
good, yes.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
So again, another requirement in that is sometimes we need to publish to an HTTPS connection, sometimes we need to publish to an HTTP connection.
I'm going to have to keep moving on with the demo
Yeah.
and not talk about authentication anymore because we have a lot more that we're going to try and cover. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We can talk about this afterwards, and it's not really, it's kind of out of the scope of what this is. This is more like basic level, publishing and how it all works. So we can talk to you about that later, though. That's fine.
Yeah.
All right, so to publish this to SharePoint, I'm going to go File, Publish, and choose SharePoint Server. And I'm going to pick the actual, this is important because I need to have the URL of the site that I'm publishing to. So travel1, see it's laurarogers.sharepoint.com/travel1. That is the site. So that's what I need when I'm publishing that. I don't need the default .aspx or any of that stuff afterwards. And when I go next, it's, of course, I've got a slow internet connection here. It's finding that, and it's asking me this question. Of course, I pick Form Library, which is what I typically do. And then once I pick Form Library, it's going to ask me if I want to create a new one or update an existing one. So I did already create one, but for this demo purpose, I'm going to go ahead and just create a new one. So I'm going to create a new form library, and this is just like going into your site and clicking Create Library. So this is creating the library for you. So I'm going to call it Travel Demo. I have a little pet peeve with spaces in document library names, so I'm going to just create this with no spaces here, and I can just go change it later, just like with any other library or list that I create. Go next. And then this is when it's talking to the server, and it's going to go try and create that library for me. It's going to take this file that I've been working on, this XSN file. It's going to create a library. This is what it's doing right now. It's creating a library, and it's taking the, if you go into advanced settings for a library and you see like what the template for that library is, that's what it usually does, is it's going to create that template, that XSN file. I have never seen that error in my life.
I have when it can't connect to the server.
Oh, okay. So it's just the slowness thing.
Yeah, probably.
Let me go back to the actual site here. Okay, so I can connect to it. Getting the content type columns failed. That's awesome.
All right, I would just open the other one.
Okay, I'm just going to open the other one I did. All right. That's what we do when we have issues like that. Okay. So in this, just kind of a side note, if you have a library you've already published and you want to be able to work on that form and edit it some more, you can always go into advanced settings and edit the template that's already been published to it. So pretend that publishing wizard worked correctly. I really think it's connectivity issues here in the room. Pretend it worked correctly, and I'm going to go ahead and pretend like it got through the wizard, and this is the point where I'm going to need to go create the submit connection. So while it's contacting the server for information, a little bit about submit versus save. So I have a big pet peeve in InfoPath with the save and save as buttons. So by default, if you've published something to SharePoint, published one of these forms to SharePoint, you're automatically going to have a save and save as button in there, and that means the user would have to fill out the form and hit save and give it a file name, which gives them all this freedom to create whatever file name they want, which can be very random and messy. And it also does not use validation when you do that. It's very important. If you have required fields and you let them hit save, the validation doesn't count at all. So again, I hate the save button. So what we're going to do next is create the submit connection, which means they're going to be submitting the form to SharePoint, which automatically saves it. So I like to take the save and save as buttons away from them so that they don't even see them. And I like to give them a submit connection that will actually submit. It will go through the validation of all the required fields and then submit that form to SharePoint. So the important thing to know about the submitting is that since you're not giving them the ability to create the file name themselves, is that you need to create a syntax for the file name as part of the submit connection. And that's one of the really important, most misunderstood things that I see in InfoPath is the submit connection and how to configure it. Because when people are filling out forms, you want the form they just filled out to be unique. You don't want other people's forms to override it. So it's important that you make sure that the file name is going to be unique to the form. So you have the option of concatenating together several fields. So you can concatenate together traveler and departure date. And as long as that's unique, then that's never going to get overwritten. One of the things that I typically do is I'll just take like whatever exact date and time down to the second that they click to create that new form, that's always unique. So I usually use that as the file name. It's a very ugly file name, but I know it's unique, and it's a good thing to use like as a standard across various forms.
Laura, what time are we supposed to be done?
We're supposed to be done at, what's it, 11:15?
I'm not sure.
11:15.
11? Now. That's what I thought.
Now? Oh, okay. So let me just show you that data connection real quick. All right. So just real important is that, see, I'm concatenating together the traveler and the request date. So that's the person's name and the request date. That means that that's going to become the file name. So it's just very important that your file name stays unique. And so this screen is, I'm allowing it if it exists, because if that form needs to go through an approval process, someone else ever needs to edit it again, it's going to allow them to overwrite that same file name and keep that unique name and keep it together. So I just don't want to have fields that are going to change. Yeah. So if they ever change the traveler name again, it's going to save it as a different file name.
From my experience, this is the one of the trickiest things inside of InfoPath. So as you start working with the form to be able to do this, to know the logic behind your form and where things are going. So it's something you definitely want to test as you're going through and make sure that you have it configured correctly, just so that it's working the way you want it to work.
And then, okay, so once you've got your submit connection, real quick, I'm going to go in here and disable my save and save as buttons. So it's in my form options. I can go uncheck save and save as so it doesn't confuse the end user, so they can only submit it. All right, so we're going to have to wrap it up. And we only had like 1 or 2 more slides, but thanks everybody for coming, and we can talk to you a little bit, but we have another session sort of right after this. So we really